Now connect this to the bluestones, the inner ring, the ones transported 140 miles from Wales. Grok's analysis of the geological sourcing data alongside acoustic research produced a finding that stops researchers cold. The Preseli Hills in Wales, the specific location those stones came from, is known to contain a high density of what geologists call sonorous rocks, stones that ring when struck, producing clear tones like bells or metal, audible at significant distances. Many of the bluestone outcrops in that region were documented producing distinct resonant tones in field studies. Grok compared the tonal profiles of different stone types from across Britain against the positions of the specific bluestones selected for Stonehenge and found a non-random pattern. The stones chosen for the inner ring were not simply the closest available stones, nor the easiest to transport. They were, based on their mineralogical composition, the ones with the strongest resonant acoustic properties. They were selected for their sound. When placed in a specific geometric arrangement inside the larger resonant cavity of the sarsen ring, these stones would not merely stand there. They would contribute to a harmonic environment, a precisely tuned acoustic space where sound behaved in ways its builders appear to have understood and deliberately engineered. What was that acoustic environment used for? Grok's cross-analysis of acoustic modeling with the locations of cremated human remains inside the monument revealed a pattern that archaeologists find profoundly unsettling. The remains are not distributed randomly around the site. They cluster, and some of their densest clusters correspond to points inside the monument where acoustic modeling suggests sound intensity would have been highest, where standing waves would have concentrated, where infrasound frequencies in the range of 95 to 120 hertz, below the threshold of hearing but well within the range of physical sensation, would have been felt in the body rather than heard with the ears. At those frequencies, the human nervous system responds. Heart rate shifts, spatial perception changes, emotional states intensify. Whether this was the intended effect or a byproduct of the structure's design cannot be proven from the data alone, but the correlation between the acoustic hotspots and the burial locations is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The people laid to rest inside Stonehenge were placed at precisely the points where the structure's resonance was strongest. Then Grok stepped back from the monument itself and looked at the landscape. And this is where the scale of what these people built becomes truly staggering. Stonehenge is not a monument. It is the center of a machine. Surrounding it for kilometers in every direction is an entire designed landscape. Burial mounds arranged in geometrically precise configurations, earthwork avenues running in mathematically straight lines, timber circles positioned at specific astronomical angles, pathways that converge on the monument from directions that correspond to significant celestial events. When LiDAR, scanning ground-penetrating radar, and geophysical mapping data were combined in Grok's analysis, the result was a site map that looks less like a collection of ancient structures and more like an engineering diagram. Burial mounds that form perfect triangles with Stonehenge as the central node. Linear avenues that run without deviation for kilometers across uneven terrain. Alignments that correspond not just to the midsummer sunrise, the famous one tourists come to see, but to the lunar standstill positions, the winter solstice sunset, and multiple planetary rising points that ancient observers would have tracked across decades. And here is the part that overturns what we thought we knew about the construction sequence. The blueprint came before the stones. Some of the surrounding landscape features, the earthworks, the older burial mounds, the initial geometric markings in the ground, are demonstrably older than the famous sarsen stone circle at the center. That means the large stones we see when we picture Stonehenge, the iconic structure, the image on every history book cover, were not the beginning of the project. They were the final phase of a plan that had already been laid out on the ground centuries earlier. Someone designed the whole system first. Then, across generations and centuries, builders filled it in, working toward a conclusion that had been determined long before any of them were born. The stones were not the idea. The stones were the answer to an idea that preceded them. This is where Grok's most disturbing finding emerges. When the construction sequence was analyzed, phase by phase, the data revealed something that contradicts every assumption about how civilizations develop. Skills are supposed to improve over time. As a society builds, it learns. As generations pass, techniques refine and precision increases. At Stonehenge, the opposite happened. The earliest placements, the first stones, the first alignments, the foundational geometric work, show an average positional deviation of approximately 2 centimeters. For stones weighing 25 tons, moved without machinery, placed without digital instruments, that is extraordinary precision. But as Grok tracked the construction forward through time, the precision deteriorates. Later phases show average deviations of nearly 7 centimeters. Tool marks on individual stones tell the same story. Different techniques applied at different times to the same stone, as if later builders were examining earlier work and trying to replicate a method they no longer fully understood. In some places, shaping work was left incomplete in one phase and then resumed decades or centuries later using a different approach. The conclusion Grok drew from this data is one that mainstream archaeology is still grappling with. The later builders at Stonehenge were not improving on a primitive original. They were trying to preserve a sophisticated original they could no longer fully comprehend. The knowledge that built the beginning of Stonehenge was not inherited forward. It was inherited backward, diminishing with each generation that tried to continue what those before them had started. That means whoever designed the system, whoever understood the lunar nodal cycle well enough to encode it across 56 pits, whoever chose sonorous stones from 140 miles away for their acoustic properties, whoever laid out a landscape-scale geometric design that would take over 1,000 years to complete, was not the rough beginning of something that would later become sophisticated. They were the sophisticated peak of something that was already declining by the time construction was underway. Stonehenge was not the dawn of a civilization. It was the last transmission of one. A civilization that understood the sky, understood sound, understood geometry and time in ways we are only now, 5,000 years later, beginning to decode. And they knew, at some level, that this understanding was slipping away from them. So they did what any people would do when they feel something precious disappearing. They carved it into stone, the hardest, most permanent material they had. They encoded their knowledge in the only medium they trusted to outlast everything that could be lost. Around 1600 BCE, activity at Stonehenge stopped. Not suddenly, not chaotically. Some stones were laid carefully on the ground. Some areas were deliberately covered. It was not destruction. It looked, in the archaeological record, like a deliberate act of preservation, a final decision to lay the system to rest in a way that might allow it to be found again, as if they knew that whatever came next would not be able to maintain it, but might someday be able to read it. And that is what Grok has now shown us is possible. For the first time in 5,000 years, we are reading it. We are beginning to understand what they encoded. And what Grok found, in those 56 holes, in those resonant stones, in that landscape-wide geometric blueprint, in that heartbreaking decline of precision across centuries, is not a monument built by people who did not know better. It is a message, carved into the earth by people who knew far more than we gave them credit for, addressed to whoever in the future would finally be capable of understanding it. That future is now. And the message is terrifying, not because it is dark, but because of what it implies about everything we thought we understood about our own past. The real question was never who built Stonehenge. The real question is what they were trying to tell us. And we are only just beginning to hear it. For 5,000 years, Stonehenge kept it secret. And we made our peace with that. We called it a temple, a burial ground, a primitive calendar built by people who did not know any better, and we quietly moved on. But in 2026, something changed. Not a new excavation, not a lucky discovery of a hidden chamber. What changed was the way we looked at what we already had. When Grok AI was fed every survey, every archaeological record, every astronomical calculation, every geological study, every measurement ever taken at Stonehenge across 3 full centuries of research, it did not find a small clue or a minor anomaly. It found a pattern so large, so precise, and so deliberately encoded that researchers who spent their entire careers studying this monument sat in silence when they saw the output. What Grok revealed was not a new theory. It was a mirror held up to 5,000 years of human civilization, and the reflection looking back was terrifying. Let's start with what Stonehenge actually is, because most people have seen pictures, but very few understand the real numbers. On Salisbury Plain, roughly 90 miles southwest of London, there is an open field, and standing in it are stones so massive that even modern engineers would struggle to move them. The outer ring, made of what are called sarsen stones, stands more than 20 feet tall. Each one of those stones weighs up to 25 tons. They were transported from the Marlborough Downs, approximately 20 miles away. But the inner ring, the blue stones, those came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, 140 miles from Stonehenge. Some new geological research suggests that certain stones may have origins even farther north, potentially Scotland, which would push that distance even further into territory that feels almost impossible. No metal tools, no wheeled transport, no cranes, just human effort across generations, moving mountains of stone across the length of Britain with absolute precision. Before Grok, we accepted this as a feat of collective faith and patience. After Grok, that explanation no longer feels complete. The construction of Stonehenge did not happen all at once. It took place in phases spanning from roughly 3000 BCE to 1600 BCE, a period of more than 400 years. That means the people who laid the first earthwork circle never lived to see the final stones placed. They were building something they would never see completed. Think about what that requires. It requires a design that survives not just one lifetime, not just one generation, but dozens of generations. It requires a plan so clearly understood, so precisely communicated that people born centuries after the original architects could continue the work without deviation. That kind of continuity across that kind of time without written language as we understand it is one of the things that most troubled researchers long before Grok entered the picture. What Grok did was show just how precise that continuity actually was, and then show exactly where it began to break down. Here is what Grok was given: 3 centuries of data. Every survey done on Stonehenge from the 17th century to today, every measurement taken of every stone, every record of soil composition, stone origin, astronomical alignment, acoustic property, and ground anomaly, every burial map, every excavation log, every geophysical scan. Separate researchers working in separate disciplines had collected all of this data in isolation, never combining their fields, never asking if the geological findings connected to the astronomical ones, or if the acoustic measurements aligned with the locations of human remains. Grok's job was exactly that, to read everything together and find what no single human mind could find by looking at each piece separately. And what it found begins with 56 holes in the ground. Just inside the outer earthwork bank of Stonehenge, there is a ring of pits, 56 of them arranged in a circle. They were first recorded in the 17th century by a scholar named John Aubrey, and ever since they have carried his name, the Aubrey Holes. For centuries, archaeologists noticed that the spacing between these pits was uneven. Some gaps were slightly wider, some slightly narrower. The accepted explanation was simple. These were people with basic tools doing their best, and small errors in measurement were inevitable. The uneven spacing was called imprecision. It was filed under human limitation and largely forgotten. Grok looked at the same data and came to a completely different conclusion. When the distances between all 56 pits were measured down to the millimeter and plotted in sequence, they did not form a random scatter of errors. They formed a wave, a rising and falling pattern that follows a fixed mathematical rule, repeating with regularity across the full circle. And that wave pattern, when compared against known astronomical cycles, matched something very specific. It matched the 18, 6-year lunar nodal cycle. The lunar nodal cycle is the period over which the moon's orbital tilt relative to Earth shifts between its highest and lowest positions in the sky. At its maximum, the moon rises and sets at extreme points on the horizon. At its minimum, those points pull toward the center. This full oscillation takes 18, 6 years to complete. It governs tides, eclipse patterns, and the moon's behavior across decades. It is one of the most complex long-term cycles in the night sky, the kind of cycle that requires decades of careful observation to even notice, let alone measure. Multiply 18, 6 by 3, and you get 55, 8, almost exactly 56, the number of Aubrey holes. Grok's analysis concluded that this match is not coincidental. The spacing of the holes, the very thing we dismissed as imprecision for hundreds of years, encodes the full lunar nodal cycle across the circumference of the circle. What we called a mistake was an instruction. If that is true, then think about what it means. These were not people casually glancing at the moon. They were people who watched the sky every single night for decades, tracking the moon's position with enough accuracy to understand a cycle that takes nearly 2 decades to complete. They understood it well enough to encode it permanently on the ground in stone and earth, so that future observers could use the circle as a tracking device, moving markers around the 56 holes to follow the moon's behavior across years, predicting eclipses, understanding tides, reading the sky in a way that required no written calculation because the calculation was built into the landscape itself. This was not a primitive people doing their best. This was a civilization doing something extraordinary. Then Grok turned to the stones themselves, and what it found in the acoustic data is where things become genuinely difficult to explain. The large sarsen stones of the outer ring, with their lintels sitting precisely on top, connecting them into a closed circular structure, create something that acoustic engineers recognize immediately: a resonant cavity. A space where sound does not simply bounce around and fade, but concentrates at specific points, reflects in controlled directions, and under the right conditions produces standing waves, zones of intensified sound energy that remain stationary in the space. Research conducted at the University of Salford, where a scale model of complete Stonehenge was tested with acoustic instruments, found that the structure significantly amplifies and shapes sound. The complete monument, when all its stones were in place, would have had specific points inside it where sound energy was dramatically stronger than at others.